continuing from where we left with the chapter biomes, zonation and succession, we see it in our syllabus guide that we next come to something concepts of zonation and succession, right? And basically what exactly they mean. So right now we are coming back to the thing, and the main ideas that we have discussed till now is that climate determines the type of biome in a given area, although individual ecosystem may vary due to local abiotic and biotic factors. So climate is generally being looked into with regard to circulation of winds, wherein winds move from higher pressure to low pressure because of the distribution of the different temperatures at different latitudes and the unequal heating of the earth at the equator vis-a-vis at the poles. We have winds which move, and hence they distribute the forests, the tropical forests and the temperate forests around 0 degree and 60 degree latitude, whereas you have deserts around 30. So that is what we discussed with regard to biomes. Now we say the main ideas was climate determines the type of biome, and succession, the next big concept that we are going to understand, leads to climax communities that may vary due to random events and interactions over time. This leads to patterns of alternative stable states for a given system. So what is succession, and what exactly do we mean when we say that there are alternative stable states within the stages of succession? So succession is the change in the state of a community over a period of time. So as time moves, how does a area undergo a period of change in the community structure and change in the shape and size of the community? How does it change over a period of time is basically what we are going to look over here. Ecosystem stability, succession and biodiversity are intrinsically linked. We take a small example to explain this concept in a much better way, and this is the Corbière, which is basically found in the Pyrenees, which is southern France. And this is a kind of an ecosystem, the Corbière, which is basically consisting of forests, a patch of area which is not having too many trees or too many green cover area, and then you have grasslands. So you have grasslands which form the foothills. Then as you go a little higher, you have the Corbière, and then you have the forests which are dense. So this is a kind of a change in the structure of the community that we see with regard to the elevation. So this is found in southern part of France, and you can see over here the Corbière are found in the Pyrenees, and the foothills of the hot Pyrenees or the high Pyrenees, patchwork of fields and woodlands. So there will be fields and there will be some trees on one side, on the higher end side, and grasslands on the lower end side, and farmed since Roman times. The Corbière is home to the Garrigue community, and the Garrigue community are basically patches of low shrub land areas. So you can see over here that you have a patchwork where there is not much of dense forest and there is not much of grassland also. So if you see it more closely, what is Garrigue? Garrigue is more or less open shrub community, usually about 50 centimeter high and rarely growing above 1 meter. The dominant dwarf shrubs are often widely spaced with considerable amount of bare stony ground between clumps of shrub, which in a very hot and dry summers give the vegetation a very parched appearance. Many species are aromatic and have small, dry, leathery leaves which often curl up in the summer, thus reducing transpiration loss. Some shrublets are chemically unpalatable to grazing animals. Others are very spiny and are thus protected. So this is the kind of characteristic of a Garrigue. Okay, so the community goes on like this. You have different species which are thorny. You can see the kind of plant species which are found in the Garrigue community. So describe the adaptations of these plants for resisting herbivory. So they have spiny structures which do not let the plants eat them, and suggest how a herbivore might be adapted to be able to eat these plants. So Garrigue forms a transitional zone between forest and grassland biome in the Mediterranean. What do we know so far? So you can see over here, there are patches of shrublands, thorny shrublands, and there are forests at the top and there are grasslands below. So here we have clearance of forests for fuel and grazing for livestock over a period of time actually has led to Garrigue attaining a semi-natural climax community. So over a period of time, Garrigue was formed naturally, but because humans have continued letting their animals graze and have used that area for collecting firewood or for collecting fuel, that this area has remained in the state of being just patches of shrubland amongst forests and grasslands. So over here you have zonation. Now when we talk about zonations, it is the change in the community over a kind of a range, right? Or an abiotic factor. So here the abiotic factor could be with respect to altitude. So as you go as distance away, elevation, as you go higher and higher, you see a change in the community structure, and that is called zonation. If you see a change in the structure community over a period of time, that's called succession. But if you see it over a range of any abiotic, like say elevation, temperature, climate, you talk about it as zonation. So over here you say distribution of Garrigue in the Corbière range with relation to elevation is that you can see at the lower zone, if you see not much higher, between 500 and 1000 you have elevation. You have between 0 to 500 you have the zone of Garrigue distribution, and up higher if you go you will see the forests. So it says there is an overlapping zone where evergreen deciduous oak and the natural climax which are the natural climax community forests are found. Then you have the zone of where evergreen and deciduous oak are the natural climax community. There is a forest biome where there is overlap with the Garrigue distribution and the forest biome. And then you have a small patch where you have the grassland, which is right at the foothills at the start of that particular forest area. Zone where dry Mediterranean grassland is a natural climax community, the grassland biome. Zone where Garrigue forms a natural transition between forest and grassland. So there is an area where there is a transition where Garrigue goes into, merges with grasslands on one end and the forest at the other. Actual zone where Garrigue forms a natural transition between forest and grassland biome because of the influence of man. So over here you have continuous place where man is either doing some kind of cultivation or is taking its livestock for grazing or is using resources as fuel, that keeps that area in a transition between the forest and the grassland and does not let that area merged into a forest or move into a grassland. It is kind of community of its own, which is basically the Garrigue ecosystem. Garrigue forms a transitional zone between zones of grassland and the forest in the Corbière range. Mediterranean grasslands biome is a natural climax community to about 100 meters or higher where local conditions allow. And Mediterranean evergreen or deciduous oak tree is a natural climax for above 1200. So there is a range of variation from ground level to 100 meters above the sea level. You have a natural biome or natural community, climax community for grasslands. For 1200 meters and higher, you have a natural climax community for evergreen and deciduous oak forests. And between them, you have the Garrigue. Distribution of grassland and forest communities are controlled by precipitation. Where precipitation is higher, the forests are formed. Where precipitation is lower, the grassland is formed. Garrigue distribution has been extended into forest through human activity, which is farming. What are the abiotic factors that we are looking at when we talk about zonation? So over here, the climatic conditions that we see of the area. So over here, we say the Corbière region, which is right at the two ends that we see over here, from January to December, that we generally, the temperatures, the rainfall is basically In terms of precipitation, the rainfall is in January till basically February, the temperatures are higher, and then the rainfall is higher, and then in October and December again there are rainfall higher. But then July, August, the rainfall is very low. With regard to temperatures, average temperature over here, it says is basically going not much higher, not more than, it says 25 degrees Celsius. So Corbière is basically found in areas which are in Pyrenees. We have a way in which succession basically is happening, wherein the area is formed as a patchwork between the forest and the grassland. There was a time when it was a bare, basically the primary succession is a concept wherein the community changes on an area of land over a period of time. So over here we see that there is a bare land, a bare rock, which is left after retreat of a glacier. And slowly with nothing on it, you can see over here in time, mosses and lichens start to colonize the rock under crevices of the rock. As they die, the organic matter is added to the weathered rock particles, making simple soils. As the soils develop, grasses and small herbaceous plants start to grow. More organic matter is added and roots of plants aid the breakup of rock material. So slowly with nothing, you had rock. Rock developed certain mosses and plants on the undersurfaces. They started reproducing and dying, adding to the nutrient content of the soil. And as a result of which there was more grasses which developed and more died, adding the nutrient. And slowly you had deeper soils, thicker soils, and then the small shrubs started. From grasses came shrubs, small shrubs, and from small shrubs came trees and larger trees. So this is basically the process of succession over time. Garrigue species naturally appear in the forest but at the low density because of competition for light, right? So that's the reason why they appear at low density. Where a gap naturally appears, a Garrigue-like community develops which has less competition for light. Forest clearance and grazing creates permanent gaps. So there were these natural gaps which were created, which were then exacerbated because of grazing and because of forest clearance. So over here we see that there were these secondary succession which happened. Primary was basically with regard to naturally, wherein you could have a small area of land which was bare, and then slowly you had small grasses and then shrubs and then forest. But then Garrigue structure maintained by the Garrigue-like structure was maintained because of grazing, and there were small area shrubs and grounds with grasses, and there was reduced grazing. Shrubs cover develops and small bushes start to colonize the grassland. So when there is less of grazing happening on grasslands and they move ahead, you have small shrubs that come into places which cover, and they start to colonize the grassland. Eventually trees established, leading to development of climax community of evergreen and deciduous oak woodland with reduced shrub and herb layer. Yes, the Garrigue formation. So the Garrigue formation it's occurring naturally, but it's being maintained by using grazing and agriculture, and the climate is generally warm and dry. The biotic community or the living community in the Garrigues they're patchworks of grasslands, thistles and thorny shrubs, and aromatic flowering plants, herbs, right? That is what we understand. Okay, so here there is another question. How might the biotic community of the Garrigue demonstrate the concept of niche? So this is again a topic 2.1 linking with topic 2.4. How might the biotic plant community of the Garrigue demonstrate the concept of niche? So a species share of a habitat and the resources in it is basically what we understand by niche. An organism's ecological niche depends on not only where it is, but what it does. So the fact over here is that the sum total of organism, biotic and abiotic resources in an environment is called a niche. The space that it needs, the food that it needs, and the climate that it needs. Fundamental niche is a set of resources a population is theoretically capable of using under ideal conditions. The sum total of organisms' use of biotic and abiotic resources in environment is called a niche. Realized niche is within the fundamental niche, the resource the population actually uses, the one which is available for it to use and which it actually uses is basically different. So the one that is present in the ecosystem for it to use is your fundamental niche. The one that it actually uses is your realized niche. So the realized niche may be smaller than the fundamental niche because of competition with other species or other individuals in the same population. So there might be an overlap of two species living together, and because of this, the realized niche becomes a little smaller. If the competition is too great between species, one species will outcompete the other. If the competition is too great within a species, then the population would collapse. Fundamental niche of species found in forest, fundamental niche of species found in garrigue, and fundamental niche of species found in grassland. However, the competition as garrigue species also found both in forest and grassland because it contains some shrubs and it contains some grasses. So garrigue species are also found in forest and grassland communities. Garrigue community species are outcompeted for resources and found in forest or grasslands. The realized niche of species of the garrigue community is found in either grasslands or the forest community. So this is the realized niche of the garrigue community. When the garrigue exists as a natural transition between forest and grassland, garrigue species faces less competition. When the forest is cleared for grazing and the garrigue that forms is maintained through grazing. Realized niche of garrigue species without and with grazing pressure. So over here it says that you have with grazing and without grazing. Limiting factors for garrigue species competing in forest community is light. Removal of tree cover open up opportunities for garrigue species. Grazing maintains that opportunity. So over here, for the thing which starts with is natural phenomena, which is competition for light, which results in the fact that there are some species which the places where they are competing for light, there might be areas where there are natural patches being formed within the forest where lights fall, and this area is then exposed to light where you have small shrubs which might just take over, and that is then taken over by humans through grazing and through farming, that patch remains as such and does not merge into a forest or go back into a forest or is turned into a grassland. Summary of conditions that allow the development and maintenance of garrigue community. So it's a dry Mediterranean climate, warm summers and mild winters, low precipitation and south facing towards the sun. Steep, stony, well-drained soil. Biotic condition man. Removal of forest vegetation for pasture and fuel. Grazing by goats, removal of tree seedlings. Patches of thorny shrubs and plants, defense against grazing by sheep and cattle. Aromatic herbs or plants with chemical defense against grazing, lavender, thyme and wormwood. So there are certain biotic conditions and there are certain abiotic conditions that let garrigue community remain the way it is and not turn into any other. Okay, consequences of rural depopulation and changes to farming in the garrigue on succession. So rural depopulation of France, basically it says that between 1960s and the early 2000s, the number of farms in France fell from 3 million to less than 1 million. Garrigue forms within the zone where Pyrenees oak forest would be the natural climax community. This is a closed canopy community with limited ground layers. Clearance of forest by man opens up the ground layer. Cattle and goats seasonally graze the pastures created. Removal of goats from the system and thorny as well as chemically unpalatable plants start to invade. This is an example of secondary succession. So the primary succession was basically just converting that area into the stages which a barren area was converted into a climax forest community. But later the area was cut down. Some patches of the forest were cut down by man, which exposed that area of land to certain species of thorns to grow. And with continuous grazing and cultivation and crop growing, that area remained as a patchwork of thorny shrubs and small trees which were not more than 1 meter in height. If the field layer of the forest system was very limited, where did the invading plants come from? These are aromatic plants. Remove the cattle as well as the shrubs, bushes and tree seedlings start to invade. Okay, removal of goats from the system and thorny as well as chemically unpalatable plants start to invade. So removal of goats, this is an example of secondary succession. Then you remove the cattle as well, and shrubs and bushes, tree seedlings start to invade. With only cattle to graze the pastures of garage need to be cleared by man to remain shrub-free, this is labor intensive. Over time, more shrubs grow, secondary succession. Eventually, trees start to appear in the system and less pasture is clear and available for grazing. And then you have, without continued grazing or clearance, eventually the area reverts to closed forest. This is the problem for biodiversity. Biodiversity in the garage is maintained by goats grazing the area. It is man-made system of high biodiversity importance. Climax mixed evergreen and deciduous oak forest covers clearance to provide grazing and fuel. Grazing by goats and cattle maintains an open garrigue community of low spiny shrubs and aromatic flowering plants with grass patches between. Continued grazing by goats and cattle maintain the garrigue as a semi-climax community. So you can see over here that this is a semi-climax community because of man's interference. Man has allowed it to remain as such and not let it move to a complete evergreen and oak deciduous forests. Reduction in grazing pressure, herbivory, because of rural depopulation and changing farming practices, in particular fewer goat herds, allow more shrubs and tree saplings to develop. So if you slowly are removing the cattle and the goats from that area for grazing because of the fact that there are the kinds of plants which are not being eaten by the cattle, then slowly that area will turn over time into a forest community. Tree saplings established from the surrounding oak forest on higher and steeper slopes of transport of matter through surrounding ecosystem, reducing amount of grazing available. So there might be certain saplings which might migrate or move from the upper regions of the oak and the oak or a deciduous forest into these patches, which then will convert these patches also into a forest. Secondary succession leads to re-establishment of mixed evergreen and deciduous oak forest climate community, clearance of current vegetation to provide grazing and fuel. So again, you can see over here that this is a kind of a flow chart which is talking in terms with regard to succession and zonation. Succession is the change in the structure of community over time. Zonation is the change in the structure of community along a gradient. So over here, the gradient was that at the lower hills of the forest, you had grasslands. As you moved higher, you had areas of patches, which was the garrigue, which were small grasses with thorny shrubs. And then higher up, you had forest of oak and deciduous evergreen forests. That was a climax. When we look at the area through succession, we see that over here, that area which was basically the climax, which was the mixed evergreen and deciduous oak forests, some of the area was cleared for grazing and for fuel by man. Man introduced goats and introduced cattle, which actually made that area as an open garrigue community of low spiny shrubs and aromatic plants with patches of grasses in between. And the man continued with his grazing of goats and cattle to maintain the garrigue as a semi-climax community. Slowly, because of reduction in grazing over time, there was this particular, the fact that people started moving away from farming in France, and they had fewer goat herds or cattle to move them to browse or to graze that area. You had more shrubs and tree saplings develop, and as a result of which the area which was initially a forest cover area underwent a form of secondary succession, wherein because of damage being done, it was retrieved back to the original state, and this Garrigue community slowly became full or became re-established as an evergreen forest. So it says over here, there is an alternative stable state, which was the fact that if you continue with a grazing and if you continue with some form of farming in that land, it stays in a semi-stable state. If you remove the cattle, if you remove the goats, it turns and goes back into being a mixed evergreen oak woodland forest. So the area which basically, it's a secondary succession, is nothing but an area which has been initially, there was a forest which was a climax community, was then destroyed and turned back into a plain area, and then slowly over time it retained back and became an original climax community. Whereas primary succession is, there was nothing, it was a bare land, bare area, and slowly over time that area slowly became, through various serial stages, reached a climax state. Whereas a secondary succession, there was a climax community, it got destroyed, and then slowly it turned back and went to its original state. So you have secondary succession which is being seen in case of the Garrigue community in the Pyrenees, which was basically done by man. Why would rural depopulation lead to secondary succession? Between 1960s and the early 2000s, the number of farms in France fell from 3 million to 1 million, and of the fact that over here there was the original climax community, because of certain intermediate disturbance, it actually turned into a semi-climax, which was basically in between the forest and the grasslands. But because of less interference and less disturbance, it went back to becoming the climax stable state that it was in. Garage community depend on cycles of disturbance, man clearing the land and goats grazing the land. We look at how productivity changes through the cycle of succession. So when we look at this particular Garrigue community, as primary succession progresses, primary succession happens on a bare area of land where there is nothing growing initially. As primary successions happen, net productivity usually increases to a maximum. So net productivity increases because the area is open now to more of plants to grow in, because that area is being then taken over by plants who are growing in a very vigorous speed, and it reaches a maximum, and then when it starts reaching a climax, the number of the net productivity tends to increase, and then once it reaches a stable state, it starts to decrease. Why might this be the case, that it might just decrease? As primary succession progresses, net productivity usually increases to a maximum and thus decreases as the community reaches a climax stage. As primary succession progresses, net productivity usually increases to a maximum, and then successional stages of the garage with rapidly growing young tree saplings. So over here you have the area which is a transition between the grasslands and the trees that are growing, and you can see on your right a mature oak and a woodland forest tree which is basically closed and is growing slowly. So you can see over here the net primary productivity is growing fast, and as it reaches a climax stage, the net productivity slows, because now the initially net productivity is basically GPP minus R. So over here the respiration is more than the amount of organisms which are growing are more, so respiration is higher, hence NPP is higher. Once NPP is reached its climax, NPP is equal to, so the amount of respiration, NPP is equal to R, and then you have the amount of NPP and GPP are almost equal, as a result of which now there is a fall in the net productivity. So this was a small case study to help you understand with regard to zonation and succession as to how changes in the community of, let's say, a transition community wherein you can see over here, which we look into with simple definitions as to the fact that what is happening in a stage of. So this was just an example to understand this concept of zonation and succession. So zonation happens along a gradient, which can be height, which can be any abiotic factor, and succession happens over time. It's temporal change, and zonation is spatial change. What we saw right now was in the Pyrenees, where you had grasslands, then you have had Garrigue, and then you have forest area. So here it says that you change, there was zonation which was seen, and then over a period of area also you saw changes which were succession. So succession is basically, it starts with the climax. The primary succession is where there is nothing growing, like we had over here. Yeah, there is nothing growing, and then on slowly and slowly on that, you can see that, so succession where there was bare rock, and slowly and slowly, over a period of time, it is colonized by pioneer species, then those decompose and return the nutrients to the soil, which then leads to a formation of topsoil layer, and then you have grasses, and then you have shrubs, and then you have small shrubs and tall trees. So this is primary succession. Secondary succession was when there was already a forest which then got destroyed, just as in case with regard to the Pyrenees, and then you had another temporary, there was a disturbance which led to temporary cereal community being established, and as a result of which you had slowly and slowly, because of the fact that that there was removal of certain elements which were leading it to remain in that state, that the community turned back and returned to climax. So as we have seen that how does productivity change with regard to succession, in the initial stages the productivity increases because the plants are occupying large areas, and then slowly it reaches climax, it decreases, and you have biomass also which increases and then becomes stable. The ecosystem also is highly degraded, and then it actually returns stability. Diversity also increases and then falls and decreases. Okay, greater habitat diversity leads to greater species genetic diversity, more habitats, more environmental variation, more niches and more species. With this, we stop with regards to succession and zonation, and then we come back, we discuss something with regard to what are R strategists and what are K strategists, which are the next important things, and how does gross productivity changes through the stages of succession. Thank you.